Before German officers ever wrote about American paratroopers with fear, they laughed at the very idea of them. In the years leading up to America's entry into World War II, German military doctrine was built on experience. The Wehrmacht had perfected combined arms warfare, rapid maneuver, and psychological shock. German officers believed they understood how wars were won, and more importantly, how enemies broke. Paratroopers, in German thinking, were a tool, useful, dangerous in limited ways, but never decisive on their own. The Germans had their own airborne forces. They had used them in the early days of the war with daring success. But those operations came with heavy losses. From Crete onward, German high command viewed large airborne assaults as costly and risky. Paratroopers, they believed, were elite, but fragile. Once scattered, they were vulnerable. Once isolated, they were doomed. When intelligence reports began mentioning American airborne divisions, German officers reacted with skepticism. The United States, in their minds, was inexperienced, undisciplined, obsessed with technology over tradition. How could such an army produce effective paratroopers, soldiers who required extreme discipline, initiative, and mental toughness? Many German officers believed American airborne units would be reckless imitations of European originals. Poorly trained men thrown from planes simply to make noise. A psychological gimmick, not a serious threat. Early propaganda reinforced this belief. American soldiers were portrayed as loud, careless, overly confident. Democracy, German ideology claimed, produced soldiers who questioned orders and lacked obedience. The idea that such men could survive alone behind enemy lines seemed absurd. And yet, quietly, German defensive planning began to change. By 1943, reports from North Africa and Sicily hinted at something unsettling. American airborne operations were messy, but persistent. Units landed off target, took casualties, and still continued their missions. Small groups regrouped independently. Junior officers made decisions without waiting for orders. This behavior confused German commanders. German doctrine valued centralized control. Initiative existed, but within strict limits. American paratroopers appeared to operate differently. They did not wait for perfection. They adapted. Still, fear had not yet set in. That changed in Italy. German officers began writing short notes in their journals after night engagements. Mentions of sudden gunfire, of confusion, of enemies appearing where none should be, of flares revealing figures already behind defensive lines. These were not full confessions yet. More like irritation, annoyance, discomfort. But beneath the words lay something new: uncertainty. Paratroopers disrupted the most sacred German assumption: that front lines mattered, that depth provided safety, that the rear was secure. American airborne troops shattered this illusion. German officers were trained to read battlefields like maps. Clear lines, clear zones of control. Paratroopers erased those lines. They turned order into chaos before the first ground units even arrived. And worse, they came at night. German diaries from late 1943 begin mentioning nervous sentries, false alarms, and constant expectation of attack. Soldiers fired at shadows. Units wasted ammunition on sounds. Sleep became rare. Officers noticed morale slipping, not because of casualties, but because of anticipation. The fear of what might already be behind them. Still, many German commanders told themselves this was temporary, that airborne troops could only cause confusion, not defeat. That once daylight came, paratroopers would be hunted down and destroyed. They underestimated what fear does to an army. Because fear does not require numbers. Fear does not require victory. Fear only requires presence. And American paratroopers were learning how to be everywhere at once. German officers had not yet written the word fear in their diaries, but it was coming. PS/PS. The fear did not arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, between radio messages, during broken sleep, in the moments when nothing happened, but everything felt wrong. For German officers, the true terror of American paratroopers was not their firepower. It was their timing. They came at night. German defensive doctrine relied heavily on visibility and control. Daylight favored organization. Maps made sense. Orders flowed downward. Units held defined sectors. The battlefield, though dangerous, was understandable. Night erased that certainty. When American paratroopers began dropping into German rear areas under cover of darkness, the war changed in a way German officers had not prepared for. These were not frontal assaults. They were invasions of space the Germans believed was safe. Diaries from Italy and later Normandy begin to reflect this shift in tone. At first, the entries are technical, mentions of enemy parachutes sighted, scattered landings, minor engagements. The language is controlled, professional, but between the lines, something darker appears. Confusion. Paratroopers rarely landed where German intelligence expected them. Winds scattered them. Anti-aircraft fire forced pilots to alter courses. Drop zones dissolved into forests, villages, and hillsides. What German officers soon realized was that this chaos worked in America's favor. Small groups of American paratroopers began appearing in impossible places. A bridge thought secure suddenly came under fire. A road intersection erupted in gunshots. A command post lost communications after a brief, violent skirmish. German officers wrote about phantom units, about enemy forces of unknown size, about constant uncertainty. They did not know how many Americans had landed. They did not know where they were. And worst of all, they did not know where they would strike next. This uncertainty infected every level of command. Junior officers requested reinforcements that did not exist. Messages to higher headquarters were delayed, incomplete, or contradictory. Units were ordered to respond to threats that vanished before they arrived. American paratroopers rarely stayed in one place. They attacked, disrupted, and moved on. Their goal was not to hold ground. It was to unbalance the enemy. German diaries begin to show frustration turning into anxiety. One officer described the night as endless. Another wrote of gunfire without direction. A third noted that his men fired at sounds, not targets. Sleep disappeared. Officers began rotating sentries more frequently, not because doctrine required it, but because exhaustion was eroding judgment. Soldiers jumped at noises. Vehicles stopped suddenly. Units hesitated to move without daylight. This was the real achievement of American airborne troops. They forced the Germans to fight ghosts. Unlike Soviet attacks, which overwhelmed with mass, or British advances, which followed set patterns, American paratroopers felt unpredictable. They did not follow what German officers called the logic of battle. This unpredictability terrified professionals. German military culture valued order above all. Even chaos had structure. But airborne operations introduced disorder without boundaries. An officer could no longer trust that the rear was safe. He could no longer trust that his flanks were clear. He could no longer trust that a quiet night meant security. The sky itself had become an enemy. Parachutes drifting down silently shattered the illusion of control. Flares revealed shapes already inside defensive lines. By the time firing began, it was too late to organize a response. And perhaps most unsettling of all, American paratroopers did not retreat when discovered. German officers expected isolated airborne troops to withdraw or surrender. Instead, they fought aggressively, even when outnumbered. They delayed, distracted, and absorbed German attention far beyond their numbers. One diary entry noted with disbelief that enemy paratroopers appear unconcerned with being surrounded. This behavior made no sense to German officers trained to preserve combat power. But American paratroopers operated under a different logic. They were already behind enemy lines. Survival depended on movement, initiative, and audacity. Waiting meant death. Action created opportunity. German officers were forced to react, not plan. And reaction is the enemy of control. By the end of these early airborne encounters, something had changed. The tone of German diaries shifted. Words like annoying and disruptive gave way to phrases like dangerous, unsettling, and difficult to contain. Fear had not yet been fully admitted, but it was no longer hidden. The night no longer belonged to Germany, and German officers knew it. P/P/P. What terrified German officers most about American paratroopers was not their numbers. It was the impossibility of knowing their numbers. German military thinking was built on calculation. Strength was measured. Enemy units were identified, tracked, and classified. Decisions were made based on estimates that, while imperfect, followed logic. American paratroopers destroyed that logic. After the first airborne operations, German officers began to realize a disturbing truth. A handful of paratroopers could create the illusion of an entire division. And they did it deliberately. American airborne doctrine encouraged initiative at the lowest level. If a unit landed off target, it did not wait for orders. It did not retreat to search for higher command. It acted. Bridges were attacked. Roads were cut. Communications were sabotaged. Enemy movements were harassed. Each action was small, but together they created paralysis. German officers wrote repeatedly about attacks that made no tactical sense. A machine gun burst here, a sudden ambush there, a roadblock appearing, then vanishing. Units reported contact with enemy forces of unknown size again and again. In reality, these forces were often no more than a squad, or even fewer, but German commanders could not assume that. Doctrine demanded caution. If paratroopers were present, larger formations might follow. If resistance appeared light, it could be bait. Every decision carried risk. So German units slowed. Orders were delayed. Columns halted. Reserves were held back, just in case. Entire battalions were redirected to hunt down shadows. German diaries begin to reflect this exhaustion. Officers complained not of casualties, but of constant alarms, of messengers arriving breathless with reports that contradicted each other, of radios clogged with incomplete information. Command posts became nerve centers of anxiety. One officer wrote that he felt blind. Another admitted that the enemy seems to be everywhere and nowhere. A third recorded that his men no longer trust silence. This was exactly the effect American airborne planners hoped for. Paratroopers were not meant to defeat German formations head-on. They were meant to disrupt timing, to delay reinforcements, to fracture coordination at critical moments. German officers understood timing better than most. They knew that even a few hours of delay could decide a battle. A bridge destroyed, a road blocked, a unit arriving late. American paratroopers attacked these moments relentlessly. German attempts to respond revealed deeper problems. Counterattacks required concentration, but concentration required certainty, and certainty no longer existed. When German units attempted to hunt paratroopers, they often walked into ambushes. When they secured one area, another erupted behind them. The battlefield felt alive, shifting, hostile in every direction. This created a psychological burden that no training manual addressed. German officers were trained to fight armies. They were now fighting uncertainty itself. Sleep deprivation worsened judgment. Officers wrote of nights spent fully dressed, pistols at hand. Of maps spread endlessly across tables, revised again and again. Of decisions made with incomplete information and the guilt that followed. Some officers began to suspect that American paratroopers were deliberately exaggerating their presence, that they were firing sporadically, moving constantly, making themselves appear larger than they were. This realization did not reduce fear. It increased it, because it meant the enemy understood German psychology. American paratroopers were not simply soldiers. They were disruptors, saboteurs of confidence, manipulators of expectation. German officers noticed another unsettling trait. Captured paratroopers, when interrogated, often displayed calmness. They spoke openly. They showed no sign of panic or despair. Even when isolated and surrounded, they behaved as if rescue or relief was inevitable. This attitude baffled German interrogators. Most isolated soldiers, German or otherwise, showed desperation, fear, urgency. American paratroopers showed patience. This suggested something terrifying. They trusted their army. They believed follow-on forces would arrive, that chaos was temporary, that the larger plan was unfolding. German officers, increasingly isolated themselves, lacked that certainty. By the time of Normandy, this psychological imbalance reached its peak. German command structures were strained to the breaking point by airborne chaos before the main landings even began. Conflicting reports flooded headquarters. Units moved without coordination. Reserves were committed blindly. And all of it began with men falling silently from the sky. German diaries from this period contain a shift that historians later found striking. The language becomes personal. Officers no longer write only about units and movements. They write about nerves, about fear, about the sense that control has slipped away. American paratroopers had not destroyed German armies. They had undermined German confidence. And once confidence is gone, command becomes guesswork. The battlefield no longer belonged to those with the best plans. It belonged to those who created confusion faster than it could be resolved. And in that kind of war, American paratroopers thrived. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 14, 15, 17, 18, 19, 21, 24. All the formation is in. We believe that the position of war can only be swayed by the military approach. For German officers, one of the most sacred assumptions of warfare was simple. The rear was safer than the front. It was not peaceful. It was not harmless, but it was predictable. Supply depots, command posts, reserve formations, these were placed behind the lines for a reason. They were protected by distance, by order, and by the belief that the enemy would need to fight through layers of defense to reach them. American paratroopers erased that belief. When airborne drops became a regular feature of Allied operations, German officers began to understand a deeply unsettling truth. There was no longer a rear. There was only territory not yet disturbed. Diaries from Italy, Normandy, and later Germany itself reflect this realization with increasing clarity. Officers wrote about command posts relocating again and again, about vehicles camouflaged obsessively, about guards doubled and tripled, not because intelligence demanded it, but because fear did. The presence of American paratroopers turned space itself into a threat. German officers could no longer assume that roads behind the front were secure. Convoys moved cautiously, often only at night, and even then with hesitation. A single burst of gunfire could halt an entire column. Engineers were ordered to inspect bridges repeatedly, even those far from active combat. This constant vigilance drained strength. Officers noticed that their men were exhausted before battles even began. They had spent nights digging new positions, standing guard, and reacting to alarms that often led nowhere. Sleep was fragmented. Nerves were raw. American paratroopers rarely needed to destroy large targets to achieve their effect. A cut telephone line could isolate a unit. A demolished bridge could delay reinforcements for hours. A brief firefight near a headquarters could force its relocation. Each action created disproportionate consequences. German officers wrote about this imbalance with frustration. One diary entry complained that minor enemy elements force major redeployments. Another noted bitterly that the rear now consumes more attention than the front. This reversal was psychologically devastating. German command culture relied on control flowing from the rear to the front. Orders were issued, supplies moved, reserves committed. American paratroopers disrupted that flow at its source. Communication suffered first. Field telephones were sabotaged. Messengers were ambushed. Radio traffic increased, but radio also revealed positions. German officers faced an impossible choice: communicate and risk detection, or remain silent and lose coordination. Many chose silence. That silence bred isolation. Units operated without clear understanding of the broader situation. Officers made decisions based on guesswork. Rumors spread quickly. One report of paratroopers behind the lines could ripple outward, creating panic far beyond its origin. American paratroopers understood this dynamic intuitively. They targeted not just infrastructure, but confidence. A flare fired near a command post, sporadic shots in the darkness, a sudden attack followed by immediate withdrawal. These actions suggested omnipresence. German officers knew, intellectually, that airborne forces were limited, but emotionally, that knowledge offered little comfort. The mind reacts not to numbers, but to uncertainty, and uncertainty ruled the rear. Some diary entries reveal moments of near paranoia. Officers described feeling watched, hearing movement that never materialized. Soldiers firing into forests and ruins without seeing an enemy. This behavior wasted ammunition, revealed positions, and eroded discipline. Worst of all, it undermined trust. Officers began to question reports from subordinates. Subordinates questioned orders from above. Every decision felt reactive, defensive, fragile. The rear, once a place of planning and recovery, became another front, one without clear boundaries. American paratroopers also benefited from German caution. German units often overcommitted to hunting airborne troops. Infantry battalions were diverted from main engagements to secure roads or villages that no longer mattered. Reserves meant to counter Allied advances were delayed or misdirected. German officers recognized this too late. By the time daylight returned, the damage was done. Bridges were down, roads blocked, communications fractured. The main Allied forces arrived to find a disorganized enemy still trying to restore order behind its own lines. This pattern repeated again and again. German officers began recording a new reality in their diaries, the sense that the enemy was no longer outside their defenses, but inside their routines. That realization carried a deep emotional weight. War had invaded the spaces where officers once felt momentary safety. Maps, desks, radios, symbols of control, now felt vulnerable. One officer wrote that there is no place to breathe. Another admitted that rest is more dangerous than movement. Such statements marked a profound shift. Fear had moved from the front lines into the mind. American paratroopers had achieved something extraordinary. Without holding territory, without massed firepower, without prolonged engagements, they had made the entire battlefield feel hostile. And when an army feels unsafe everywhere, it cannot fight effectively anywhere. By the time German officers fully understood this transformation, it was irreversible. The rear was gone. Only uncertainty remained. Haste, period, and time. Out. Greater pacing, greater pause. By the final years of the war, something remarkable had happened inside German officers' diaries. The language had changed. Early entries from 1939 to 1941 were confident, technical, and detached. They spoke of movements, positions, and objectives. The enemy was described abstractly: units, formations, numbers. But after repeated encounters with American paratroopers, the tone shifted. Words like uncertainty, nervousness, and constant tension began appearing with increasing frequency. Some officers stopped using formal military language altogether. They wrote instead about feelings, about exhaustion, about the inability to rest, about the sense that control had slipped away. Fear had entered the record. This fear was not born from defeat in battle alone. German officers had faced defeat before. What unsettled them was the manner in which American paratroopers attacked their assumptions. Paratroopers did not fight for territory. They fought for disruption. They fought for time. They fought for the mind. German officers began to understand that every airborne operation was a psychological operation. Even when tactically limited, its emotional impact was enormous. One diary entry from late 1944 described airborne landings as events that poisoned the entire area. Another noted that even rumors of parachutists caused disproportionate alarm. These were not exaggerations. German command structures had become fragile. Fuel shortages, manpower losses, and Allied air superiority had already strained the system. American paratroopers exploited these weaknesses mercilessly. They forced German officers to make decisions under uncertainty. They compelled movement without clarity. They demanded reactions before understanding. This constant pressure eroded confidence. Confidence is essential to command. Without it, every order feels provisional. Every decision feels like a gamble. German officers felt this acutely. Some diaries reveal an almost philosophical resignation. Officers questioned whether traditional concepts of front and rear still existed. Others wondered whether war itself had changed beyond recognition. American paratroopers symbolized that change. They represented a new kind of soldier, one trained to operate without constant supervision, to improvise, to accept isolation as normal. German officers, raised in a culture of structured command, found this deeply unsettling. Captured paratroopers reinforced this impression. Interrogation reports describe American airborne soldiers as calm, even casual. They did not plead. They did not exaggerate their importance. They spoke confidently about their mission, even when it had clearly failed in tactical terms. This attitude disturbed German interrogators. It suggested that failure was expected and accepted. That success was measured not in holding ground, but in causing disruption. German officers realized too late that they were measuring the wrong outcomes. They counted casualties. Americans counted delay. They secured positions. Americans created chaos. By 1945, diary entries show a grim acknowledgement. One officer wrote that airborne landings now guarantee disorder. Another admitted that the fear begins before the landing, not after. These statements reveal something profound. The mere possibility of American paratroopers had become a weapon. Even when no drops occurred, German units behaved as if they might. Reserves were held back. Movements delayed. Positions reinforced unnecessarily. Fear had achieved permanence. This psychological transformation explains a final revealing pattern. As the war neared its end, German officers increasingly preferred surrender to American forces rather than others. Not because Americans were less dangerous, but because they were predictable in captivity. American paratroopers, so terrifying in combat, were known for discipline afterward. Prisoners were fed. Wounded were treated. Orders were followed. This contrast mattered. It suggested that the same system that created chaos in battle could also restore order afterward. To exhausted German officers, this was reassuring. In the end, the diaries tell a clear story. German officers did not fear American paratroopers because they were everywhere. They feared them because they could be anywhere. They feared them because they dissolved certainty. They feared them because they fought a different kind of war. A war where confusion mattered more than conquest, where initiative mattered more than obedience, where fear arrived before the enemy was even seen. American paratroopers never needed to defeat German armies alone. They only needed to make German officers doubt themselves. And once doubt entered command, defeat was inevitable. That is why, in the quiet pages of wartime diaries, written without propaganda and without an audience, German officers recorded something they rarely admitted aloud. They were afraid.